What's up, guys? Michael here. Now, like everyone else who exists mostly on the internet, I've been watching the two most hyped up shows of the year, The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, and House of the Dragon. These shows have a lot in common. They're both continuations of popular fantasy books that gained massive popularity in adaptations. They both feature bleached blonde baddies, and they both explore themes and characters established in the original films and series. But maybe most importantly, they're both prequels.
And there was a time when the world was so young, there had not yet been a sunrise. But even then, there was light.
This might not seem like a big deal, but we think this is what makes these shows so relevant to our current moment. Is this because we're worried about being cooked by a dragon or skewered by an orc? Not so much. It has more to do with how we can't seem to stop thinking about the end of the world. And lucky for us, there's some philosophers who think that thinking about the apocalypse might actually be a good thing. We'll explain in this Wisecrack Edition on the Rings of Power and House of the Dragon. How is the world going to end? In case you're waiting to watch both shows while avoiding your family this Thanksgiving, here's the deal. The Rings of Power is the super expensive pet project of Jeff Bezos that doesn't look like a giant penis. It's a prequel to the Lord of the Rings trilogy, taking place about 5,000 years before Frodo ever took his furry feet out of the Shire, or hobbits as we know them even existed for that matter. Because of the time gap, the only familiar faces are some of our elven friends, because these pointy-eared nerds live basically forever. And unlike the Peter Jackson films, The Rings of Power isn't based on a single book or story. Instead, it's primarily based on the appendices from the original book. Now, the show is legally unable to use material from the Silmarillion and cannot continue the Lord of the Rings or Hobbit stories. So it introduces a lot of new characters, but it's mostly oriented around the looming threat of our old buddy, Sauron. House of the Dragon, which takes place about 200 years before the events of Game of Thrones, is based on the book Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin. His middle initials stand for rum and Robitussin, his favorite cocktail. Please don't drink that, because I feel like then I'd be legally responsible for your death. It's more of a history book than a novel, and it's written by a historian from within the Game of Thrones universe. The show explores the era before Daenerys Targaryen's ancestors lost all their power and all their dragons, but it has about the same amount of incest. And like the original series, the whole thing is marked by lots of whispers and intrigue, and also lots of butts. So why did both franchises go the prequel route? One answer is that they're both based on wildly popular IP that arguably had no way of moving forward sequentially. And of course, they're both basically guaranteed to make HBO and Amazon tons of money, as they know that we're just little piggies hungry for content, and we'll just slop this up like our life depends on it. The more interesting answer is that prequels, when done well, can give us a new perspective on worlds and events we're already familiar with. And more importantly, in the instance of the Rings of Power and House of the Dragon, they give us a pre-apocalyptic view of societies and worlds that we know are headed for apocalypse-level events. Now, you might be thinking, but why do stories like this really matter when we already know how things work out? Doesn't this suck the dramatic tension out of things? Now, I hear ya, but a recent example to the contrary is the success of the Breaking Bad prequel series, Better Call Saul. Even though everyone knew where our guy Saul was going to end up, it ended up being one of the most lauded shows since, well, Breaking Bad. In the case of the Rings of Power and House of the Dragon, this format allows us to better see how societies and groups in power can go from states of prosperity and stability into states of conflict, war, and collapse. And while this might in some cases preclude the type of dramatic tension we might normally associate with shows like this, i.e., when we get stressed precisely because we don't know what's going to happen, in the case of these prequels, we end up feeling something closer to dramatic irony, precisely because we do know what's coming in the future. Quick note, dramatic irony is a storytelling term coined by Aristotle, and it describes the feeling of irony we as an audience experience when we know more than the characters. It's like in the Star Wars prequels, when Padme starts a romantic affair with a teenager, but we know that teenager will turn into Darth Vader one day. So she's both hooking up with a teenager, which is dark, and Darth Vader, which is dramatic irony. But is there something especially enjoyable about the dramatic irony of watching these two stories where we feel a sense of apocalyptic doom looming just around the corner because, well, we know what's going to happen in the future? Well, historically, fantasy is similar to sci-fi in that it organizes societies in ways that reflect our own world in order to comment on it. For example, Tolkien used fantasy to say stuff like, nature is good and industrialism is bad. Others have used it to critique bureaucracy or state power. You know, it's like every story about a corrupt kingdom waiting for a good hero to show up and save the day. Others use fantasy to explore themes of race, gender, and xenophobia. But what they all do is build societies in relatively unsubtle ways, using clearly moral and immoral characters, thus making it easier for us to identify problems in our own world. So, what does this mean for fantasy stories that explore the collapse of societies or apocalyptic events? Shows like this are unique because, taken in their whole context, we have a clear perspective on the befores and afters of these events. While we know that things will go wrong, we're still not sure exactly how they will go wrong. And that's why right now feels like such a perfect moment for these shows. More so than in recent decades, it seems like we are collectively looking towards the end of the world. We even did an entire video about this, so check it out. Things like a once-in-a-century global pandemic, increasing effects of climate change, including more frequent catastrophic weather events, political unrest, rising fascism, and continued economic turmoil, have lots of us thinking about how it all might end. We see this reflected in many aspects of our culture. It's why we wanted to watch a movie that was a thinly veiled allegory about climate change killing us all, or a limited series about what the world looks like after a devastating flu took out most of the population. While it might seem extreme, stories like these end up being relatable as their characters face down potentially world-changing events and struggle to cope with existence in their aftermath. They can also provide a sense of hope, i.e., Middle-earth survived, so maybe we will too. Or at least a type of catharsis, i.e., all societies fall apart eventually, right? So, hey, at least we had a good run. But the difference between obsessing over climate change and watching the struggles of Westeros and Middle-earth is that we know what's going to happen in those places, which adds a deeper level of meaning and, in some cases, melancholy to our experience as viewers. When we're watching the pre-Sauron vibes of Middle-earth or the dragon-filled skies of Westeros, we know that things are about to turn to shit in a way that the characters don't. Arguably, this is how the aliens that discover the shards of our civilization will feel when they realize that we knew things were falling apart, but just sort of let it happen because of profit and stuff. In the Rings of Power, we get to experience the full glory of Khazad-dûm with all of its signs of beauty and affluence. But simultaneously, we know that this is going to fall apart. And we see a young Isildur, slightly reckless but seemingly good-hearted and wanting to serve his people. But we know that this charming young man will eventually screw everything up. Isildur! In House of the Dragon, we see Harrenhal as a place full of glory and power, a place where the heir to the Iron Throne is named. But we know that it's going to turn into the Airbnb of castles before it ends up completely abandoned. And of course, there's the dragons. We see King's Landing full of lots and lots of dragons. But of course, in the Westeros of Game of Thrones, at least initially, dragons no longer exist, and the pits that used to hold them are just relics from an ancient past. But in the real world, which for many feels about as bad as one big version of Mordor, we have no idea what's going to happen after things get even worse. Rather than the dramatic irony we might experience seeing the elves create the forge that Sauron will use to make the rings, or seeing the Targaryens run around as if there's no civil war around the corner. We instead get the existential dread of knowing that something bad is coming, but having no idea what it'll look like and what, if anything, might exist on the other side. So, is there a purpose in contemplating the end of our world? Or at least the potential for world-changing catastrophes, other than just seeing how quickly we can make ourselves have a panic attack, of course. My record is 49 seconds. For some philosophers and political theologians, it's actually an intellectually productive thing to do, and they call it apocalyptic thought. This is the act of considering the philosophical and theological implications of the end of the world at least as we know it, ending or changing radically into something beyond that which we can currently conceive. According to scholar Thomas Lynch, apocalypticism is rooted in this conviction that it is not just aspects of the world, but this world itself that is unethical. So the idea is that since the world as a whole is unethical or lacking, we don't need to change the world, we need a new one. It's sort of like having an older car that is beyond repair, and then you finally accept that you just gotta scrap it and apply for a lease at your local Kia dealership. This video is not brought to you by Kia. If they would like to sponsor us, that would be great. We could use the cars. They'll have no idea what you mean, but when you're filling out the lease thing, put in discount code Wisecrack and ask for 20% off your Kia Niro. We see an example of this, albeit from the bad guy side of things, and the character Adar in the Rings of Power. He's the father of all the orcs, and believing that Middle-earth has failed his children, he aims to destroy the world as it currently exists to create a new and very smoke-filled world for all of his orc babies to flourish. Imagine the cards he must get on Father's Day. Presumably, they're all written with like black bile and blood and but have really earnest messages from his children. But according to apocalyptic theorists, in some cases, reflecting on how our current world might end is actually a precondition for thinking of what new world can be created after that destruction. And it's worth noting that this apocalyptic desire is usually happening in opposition to a group or order who wants to keep things precisely as they are because of how it benefits them.
And how have you served the one with late Lady Red Wine? By eating cake?
For example, both sides of the Targaryen dynasty's desperate fight to keep themselves in power at all cost. As Lynch writes, in this case, apocalypticism is not so much the end of history, but the end of our history. If apocalypse is simultaneous revelation and annihilation, what is revealed are the gaps and fissures which are the sites of a destructive potential. Meaning that the apocalypse isn't the end of the world, but the end of a particular formation of the world. And when he says that apocalypse is both revelation and annihilation, this means that things falling apart can often expose new possibilities we may not have previously seen. It's sort of like how even though things are going pretty poorly for much of the original Lord of the Rings trilogy, in moments of seeming collapse, the bros in the Fellowship come together in new ways, pointing towards a better possible future for Middle-earth. Now, you might be thinking, hey, isn't apocalypse also a thing in the Bible? And you're not wrong, as the last chapter of God's autobiography, the Book of Revelation, is like an acid-fueled description of the world getting totally blasted apart. But this line of thought doesn't end the Bible study there, as apocalyptic thinkers also utilize the concept of messianism. In religion, messianic thought refers to the idea that some type of Messiah, often a singular figure like Jesus Christ, will come at some point in the future to save the world and bring about some new order marked by things like justice and peace. And it's no surprise that we see this theme in the work of noted Catholic boy J.R.R. Tolkien, who uses messianic characters like Frodo and Aragorn. According to Lynch, here partially quoting Roland Bohr, messianism is a subcategory of eschatology, i.e. the theology of the end of the world, one in which a particular individual, divinely appointed and directed, affects the transition from old to new. So in this way, messianic figures can be like the captains of the apocalypse, paving the way for a new world and helping to destroy the old one. And while messianic themes might make more intuitive sense in the stories of the Catholic Tolkien, George R.R. Martin, who does not strike me as the church type, has some very clear messianic themes in his own work. For example, in the original Game of Thrones series, Jon and Daenerys both function as chosen ones, coming from outside the current order to pave the way for a new world, to varying effects. In this sense, both of them, but especially Daenerys, can be seen as bringing about an apocalypse while trying to create something new. So this isn't just a concept for the religious or Middle-earth adjacent, as political and especially Marxist philosophers have also embraced this concept to think about radical political change. For example, German philosopher Ernst Bloch argued for a reading of Marxism as a humanist utopianism. Now, he thought that all freedom movements are guided by utopian aspirations, exemplified by things like the messianic parts of the Bible. He wrote that, everywhere one looks, the messianic is the last handhold of life and the ultimate resultant of the light of utopian truth. Which basically means that the messianic is what gives us hope in the face of apocalyptic situations. But the closest most of us seem to get to messianic moments in the modern era is usually during elections, when we fall under the collective, if well-intentioned, delusion that some singular figure will help foster us into a new era. And while we might not have dragons and wizards and socially acceptable incest in our own world, we have some other evil forces lurking behind the scenes that make it feel like any type of new world is basically impossible. Okay guys, you know where this is going, so say it with me: capitalism. As Thomas R.R. Lynch writes, there is a saying, often attributed to Frederick Jameson, that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. This sentiment is redundant. The end of capitalism would be the end of the world. There is no remainder not positioned in relation to capital. There are pre-capitalist, para-capitalist, and post-capitalist forms of life and exchange that are not yet capitalism or resist capitalism, yet these are all still positioned in relation to capital. Also, to be clear, Lynch's middle initials are not RR, but it felt appropriate, so hopefully he forgives me, but if not, feel free to complain in the comments. Just like how Middle-earth can't find real justice as long as Sauron and his rings exist, and the people of Westeros seem to be stuck with the Targaryen dynasty as long as their dragons fly, it seems that any modification or change which boils down to capitalism, but like different, is as useful as Sauron tweeting that Black Lives Matter. And this is why our pre-apocalyptic situation is one marked by anxiety instead of melancholy. As while we know that eventually Sauron is going to shut his eye for good, we have no idea what better or worse future we have to look forward to. But hey, at least we have great billionaires like Jeff Bezos making TV shows to help keep us distracted, while he single-handedly dismantles society to extract maximum profit while he plans his escape from this dying world in his dick ship. But what do you guys think? Are these fantasy shows training us to think about the end of the world in a productive way? Or are we all just sickos that can't stop watching shows about cousins who bang? Let us know what you think in the comments. Huge thanks to our patrons for being part of our little messianic cult, and be sure to check out our Patreon page if you haven't. Like this video to show us that there is still hope in this dark world, and subscribe if you want to do us a solid. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I say it every time, but it means a lot to us. We appreciate your support, and we love you guys. See you later.